Welcome, everyone.
Aloha.
Aloha. Thank you for joining us on the Shaka Movement's Malama Aina show. Welcome to another installment. I'm Sam Small, and this is my friend
Joe MARSHALLA.
And together we try to present to you the honest information that we're able to glean doing a fair amount of research. We spend a lot of time looking into this stuff because there's a lot of technical issues that are involved. There's a lot of nuances to some of this. There's a lot of interpretation, cross-interpretation. There's a lot of misinformation. And so it's our goal to get to the bottom of it.
To sort through it all.
Sort through it all.
And find the truth. Not our truth, but the truth.
Yeah. Something that's a little bit more objective than the information that perhaps comes from profit-motivated corporations.
Yeah. And also, let's say you met someone, right? And you
don't
find...
tell my wife.
Oh, no, okay, some guy.
Oh,
okay, yeah, still don't tell my wife.
Hey, it's a whole new world out there.
Okay, anyways, back to the subject. You meet someone, and you find out that for the last 30 or 40 years, they have been convicted for putting poison in people's drinking water and giving it to them, and those people are getting poisoned. Now they've been convicted, they paid fines, they've done time and all this other kind of stuff, but now they're out in the public. If this person gives you a glass of water, would you maybe question whether or not you should drink that water after 30 years and multiple convictions of doing it?
Even though they said that they have rehabilitated themselves?
That's correct.
I don't think I would trust them, no.
That could possibly be the situation in which we find ourselves.
Are you intimating that the agrochemical companies that are active here in Maui County have a less than reputable track record?
Well, unfortunately, that seems to be the case. That over and over again, this industry, which, check it out. This industry has nobody really overseeing them.
No.
That the people, the regulators, on the federal level, on the state level, everybody rely on the industry to tell them whether or not it's safe.
Well, the rules and regulations and procedures that are in place for the regulatory agencies to follow were written by the agrochemical companies themselves.
Isn't that convenient?
In an environment, and the environment still persists to this day, that their job is to facilitate things for the agrochemical companies. Their job is not necessarily to protect you. They have... Tyrone Hayes goes into this. We got a lot coming your way. This is a
big show, guys.
A very big show. We've got Tyrone Hayes, who appeared here on Maui this week, and we've got Jeffery Smith, who is here on Maui for a bit and going to travel around to some of the other islands. And where was I going?
Tyrone Hayes. And what happened with him, and him finding out that there were some real dangers to certain chemicals that he was studying, which he will speak about in his interview, and how the industry that hired him to see whether or not their chemicals were safe, when he proved that they weren't safe, began an entire smear campaign to just wipe him out. They created psychological profiling, going through his whole childhood to find weaknesses and looking at his wife and his kids and all these things. And he was claiming that this was happening, to people. And they said, oh, you're crazy, you're crazy, you're crazy. Well, here we are many years later, 15, I think, years later. And there's another lawsuit with this company that originally hired him.
Right.
And in that lawsuit, I revealed all the papers where Tyrone, in fact, is what's that word when vindicated, where all literally handwritten notes about how they're going to smear him, how they're going to ruin his career, how they're going to discredit him. I mean, literally going through his entire life. Oh, he has trouble with certain types of issues with women. So let's see if we can exploit that and get it. And on and on and on. So. Anyways.
You can see Tyrone Hayes spoke here on Maui this past week. Hawaii Seed brought him in conjunction with the Mom Hui and GMO-free Maui. They did a fantastic job of bringing him here. There's a whole Hawaiian tour that he's been talking on all the islands. And one of the favorite moments of mine during his talk is as he's explaining how in great, he's giddy because he's able to actually see the internal internal documents from Syngenta that got subpoenaed in some other case and got released to the public, he's able to see specifically how they targeted him and how they tried to destroy him professionally and personally. And he, you know, he makes his presentation and he says, what kind of idiot would leave this in the file?
Right, exactly.
What kind of company are these people running? And how stupid are they that they would actually write this stuff down and leave it in the file?
So they're probably destroying it nowadays, you know?
And you'll hear, too, we've got a talk coming from Jeffery Smith, and he says that similar things have happened to Monsanto Corporation when they have, in the past, when they've left certain sites where they did manufacturing, they did production of chemicals, poisonous chemicals. They walked away from different places, and it was discovered later that they knew what was going on. They knew what was in the soil. They knew what they were doing was hurting people, and they did it anyway. And they got sued for it eventually.
$700 million.
Eventually.
But they did it, yeah.
We've got a really delicate environment here in Hawaii. If you haven't figured that out, this is a very, very fragile environment. And the things that they're doing in their fields are leaking out into our communities. They're leaking out. The fugitive dust gets into the air. It's on your car. It's on your clothes. It's on your kids. The stuff that they're spraying gets into the air. It spreads. It's in the water. And none of this stuff has been tested properly. Yeah. Some of these chemicals were created in World War II and in Vietnam. The components of Agent Orange. Agent Orange is illegal to use, but the individual components of Agent Orange are being used here on Maui, in Maui County. You are being exposed to these toxins in ways that none of us have any control over. It's another form of colonialism. They might as well be running plantations. They might as well be starting over the plantation process because they are stealing the land, they are stealing your rights, and they are stealing the health and well-being of our families here in Maui County. And it's our job to make it stop. And if we don't make it stop, they're actively trying to take away our right to make it stop. They want to preempt the rights of the county, to take the right of the county away to regulate things in an appropriate way. The county is allowed to be more particular than the state or the federal government. Yeah. The county is currently allowed to do that.
They can be safer.
We are allowed to be safer, and in fact, we have a responsibility. It's a trickle-down responsibility. The federal government does what they can do, the state does what they can do, and Hawaii State or Hawaii does nothing because they have no resources allocated to this.
And there's not a single law or regulation on GMOs specifically at all.
No, all of this stuff, happened. All of the rules that exist were in place long ago before this even became an issue. So they're just riding on this historical right that they have, and
so we got some questions.
We
got some questions about all this.
This is not stuff that we're just making up. I mean, all across Europe, all across China. China is rejecting GMOs.
Russia too now.
And it's not just because of the questions of the GMO stuff itself. I mean, there's a lot of questions about that. Genetically modified agents. We got the BT corn here. So BT corn is modified in a way to create inside the corn itself a toxin. And we breathe the pollen of that corn because it gets into our air. The pollen gets released. And so breathing in that pollen into your lungs, there's a potential for that toxin to start growing in you.
In your lungs, and amongst the bacteria inside your lungs. It's,
it's scary stuff.
There's a lot of, I mean, I'm just trying to bring it back down here because this is how, we all feel. When you actually begin to understand these truths, It is very natural to get really angry. It is very natural to just really get a heightened sense of energy within your being. And so our job here is to bring forth as many of the facts and as much of the truth as possible so that then you can see exactly what is happening to us, because we are an experiment. Simple as that.
Guinea pigs.
We are, in fact, the largest biological and chemical test site in the world, right here. And, it's like, come to Maui, come to paradise, stay for the, or, I forget the saying it is, but it's something like, come for the beauty and stay for the poisons, or something like that. Because the truth is that everything that's grown here is shipped out. We don't eat the food here other than after it gets processed and comes back into our grocery stores. There's no benefit for us. They talk about jobs, and we're going to talk about that later with Jeffery Smith. Concerning the jobs, and my job is worth some child's life. There's some real serious questions there, and there's actually greater job opportunities with organic farming and sustainable farming.
It's
and
more labor
remediation.
intensive.
Yeah.
So it requires more
healthier
jobs.
environment, more job security, creates sustainability within our economy. It actually grows our economy because the money actually comes back to our economy, going away.
Think of the lost opportunity, the opportunity costs, the social opportunity costs of all these people on Maui, all these residents on Maui being persistently sick.
Yeah, it has gone up. I mean, come on, folks.
How often,
look around.
How often now do you hear of somebody that has some rare disease?
Or chronic cough that's going on that they just can't seem to get rid of, or children.
A food allergy,
right.
That suddenly you didn't have a food allergy before, but suddenly you're having a food allergy. Maybe it's a rash. Maybe it's your kids. How many of you folks have kids that have some developmental disorder? We're hearing stories and Tyrone Hayes talks about it because the atrazine that he follows, which is sprayed here on Maui, the sugarcane sprays atrazine. They use it heavily in the first 18 weeks when they plant.
And I just heard recently
that
it's actually used within the GE crops as well, the genetically engineered crops.
So atrazine is all over the place. Well, atrazine is a chemical castrator. It feminizes mammals, reptiles.
This is based on all the research that Tyrone Hayes brought forth,
and not just him. I mean, you'll see in his presentation, and I urge you to see his full presentation. You can find it on the web, GMO Free Maui. It's been posted on YouTube. But there's a whole slew of issues of things that assert themselves, problems that assert themselves to male children born while the mother is exposed to atrazine. And there's problems with the development of the testes, there's problems of the development of the penis itself. Even the urethra doesn't go all the way to the tip. The kids are born, they can't pee.
That's a little graphic but it is what's happening, and happening at an alarming rate all over the world where these chemicals are being used. And we just have named 2 chemicals, and there's 90 of them that they're using here. And each one they say is regulated, and if you use it just right, and it'll be safe and what have you. Is there actually a safe level of chemical that you would say is okay in your body? Think about it. Somebody has decided that it's okay for you to have some of their chemicals in your body.
How much?
Yeah.
Who gets to say?
Yeah, it's safe. Don't worry about it. But what they what they don't look at then is the combinations of chemicals. You add any 2 chemicals together and you get a new experience, a new chemical. You add 5, you add 10. Well, we got 90 of them. That means there's over a trillion, more than drops of water in the ocean, possible combinations that somebody says it's okay. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Hey, no problem at all. It's okay for you to have our chemicals in your body. Don't worry about it. Did you give permission for that?
I didn't. No, I didn't. Think of it like, two different chemicals, pharmaceuticals. It's the same thing. It's the same protocol. That's why Dr. Lauren Pang is so valuable to us here on Maui, because he's a physician. He's a medical doctor, and he looks at the chemicals as if they were pharmaceuticals, because it's the same protocols. It's the same things that happen. And so if, just think about it. If they say, if you have something to drink, and maybe you shouldn't mix
muscle relaxer.
A muscle relaxer. So you got, each one of them has a certain effect on you when you take them individually. But you take them in concert with one another, and it's like taking a sledgehammer. They each make the other much more potent and much more dangerous to you, and that's what's going on in the fields. They're spraying individual chemicals in concert with one another, and the results may be disastrous. We don't know, they don't know, and we want to know.
Yeah.
You want to know. And the moratorium that has been called for by the 5 Maui citizens to just hold on here. Enough already. Hold on. Let's stop what they're doing temporarily, and let's have a study of exactly, not what goes on in the laboratory, not a laboratory study the way that they like to do their studies, where individual components are studied on cell tissue, and there's no when they spray in the field, they spray it with a dispersing agent, a surfactant. It helps the stuff to penetrate. By definition, it helps it to penetrate. That's not the way they test them in the laboratory.
Yeah.
But it is the way that they spray them here on Maui.
So we just really want to know what's going on.
Yeah, what's going on?
What's actually happening in the soil? Well, the law, the new ordinance, the initiative law that's gone forth that calls for a suspension, asks for a complete environmental and human impact
health
studies and study, which means that if they want to continue doing these things, they have to prove right here, right here in River City,
right where it counts.
right here in Maui,
where it affects you,
what's happening here, not what happened in the laboratory, not what some scientist said over here. We don't care what anyone says anywhere else in the world, and what any other laboratory said anywhere at any time. We want to know what's happening here. What's happening to our soil, what's happening to our children, what's happening to our water, what's happening to our air, what's happening to our reefs, what's happening to cross-pollination, and on and on and on. And when we know that, well, then we have an informed public.
Yeah.
And that informed public can decide whether or not they want to live within an environment that might be harmful to their lives. So with that said,
ultimately, this could all end with the federal government coming in and saying, sorry to tell you, but you are a sacrifice zone, Hawaii. For national security purposes, we need this GMO corn we need these companies to be able to continue to do this, and you people can just suck it up.
It's a possibility.
And,
it's a possibility.
At least it would be honest, because that's the climate that we're in now, and they're hiding it from you.
Yeah.
We're going to roll for you an interview that I was able to conduct with Tyrone B. Hayes. He's just a wonderful researcher. He's a fantastic scientist and has done great independent work that has been replicated and confirmed by other researchers around the world. The agrochemical companies have tried to destroy him. They have tried to discredit the work, and they have not been able to do so.
So before we go to that tape, I just want to get back to a mood, if you will, of being a truth seeker. Because we can get really excited about this, and we can point out all the heinous things that have happened. And, the truth doesn't get any more true by screaming it, by yelling it. And we actually do have a real chance. There are all different types of possibilities that could derail our desire, your desire, to make sure things are safe. But until they do them, all I can do for myself is to focus on the fact that we, the citizens, have this opportunity, and may not have it again, but we have this opportunity right now to make this difference and to really see we could be the generation. Think about this. from the beginning of time until right now, and from right now for the rest of eternity, there will never be another you. But what is that you going to do with its time on this earth? What is that you? What is your legacy? What are your children? What are your grandchildren going to say? My grandpa, my grandma, they did this. They did that. And what if your legacy was, my grandpa and grandma, they're the ones who stopped these horrible things that were happening. And when your legacy aligns with Sam's legacy and my legacy, we build a heritage. And it is that heritage of truly protecting the Aina, and truly protecting the children, and truly doing the right thing. And I ask you to hold that to be true, because there's never been another you, and I implore you to consider using your life to do what is right, because we are borrowing this land right now from our children, from our grandchildren. And do we borrow it and give it back to them all poisoned and horrible? I would hope not. So let's give our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren land, air, water, reeds.
Clean, clear, safe, healthy.
So that they can enjoy it for generations to come.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
Here's a video. Take a look. We'll be
Enjoy.
back. I was able to give you a little bit of a download of what's going on here on Maui. Do you have some advice for the residents of Maui and what they need to consider in all of this?
Well, my advice is to do what it appears is already being done, and that's to keep fighting for personal rights, keep fighting for public health, fighting for the rights of our children, fighting for the rights of the environment. Much of what the agrochemical industry is about is making money, not feeding the world. 20% of the world dies of starvation because they don't have access to staples, and our biggest crop in the U.S. we eat directly less than 2% of. That's corn. So fighting for public health, and don't assume that somebody else is looking out for you.
Well, aren't there regulatory agencies that are supposed to be looking out for it?
There are regulatory agencies. I believe that those regulatory agencies, such as the FDA and the EPA, have been compromised. They are political entities run by political appointees, the EPA, for example. And I believe that even when the science is there, the EPA itself has even said that they put a price tag on human health and on human life, and they weigh that against the cost of getting rid of a chemical from the environment.
Well, doesn't the EPA do its own testing? Is there anything independent that they do?
There are EPA scientists that do testing of chemicals for sure. In the case of atrazine, for example, 3 of the most damning and most significant findings with atrazine are that when pregnant rats are exposed, it causes abortion. It also causes mammary or breast abnormalities in female fetuses that are exposed in utero, and it causes prostate disease in male pups that are exposed in utero. 3 independent EPA laboratories produce that science, and yet that science is not being used to regulate the chemical properly, in my opinion.
And why do you think that is?
Politics and economics. I think the EPA and I think all the scientists involved, I'll show some data now from the company, that they know exactly what these chemicals do, but now atrazine, for example, being used on corn is all tied up in the ethanol industry and the renewable fuels industry and all those, the lobbyists and the politics and economics around those issues.
How did this get so out of control?
I think part of it is history. So when most of these chemicals, when most of the 80,000 chemicals, certainly most of the pesticides that we use came on the market, there was no EPA. So now we've got chemicals out there that were never regulated, that were never tested. They were tested, for example, in World War II and then just brought here for agricultural purposes. Now the EPA is doing its best to try to catch up and regulate chemicals that are already out there that we've already been exposed to for lifetime already.
So, for instance, we have a major agrochemical company here on Maui that presented to the county a whole stack of 2,000 reports. Is that stuff current, and is that stuff accurate? Has anybody verified that stuff?
Depends on what you call a report. I mean, for example, Syngenta likes to say that atrazine has been shown to be safe in over 7,000 studies. Well, those studies aren't available to you or me. They aren't available to the public. They haven't been peer reviewed, so they haven't been vetted in that way. These are sometimes reports of just measurements or who knows what it is they've tested. But certainly of the published literature that's out there, one, there's not that much out there on many of the chemicals that we're talking about, atrazine being one of the exceptions. And two, what's out there is the EPA is obliged to weight more heavily these industry studies, and they more or less collaborate with industry on these studies to make the regulatory decisions.
So those regulatory decisions essentially favor the agrochemical companies.
Absolutely. They favor the the chemical companies.
And what watchdog agencies are there?
Well, that's a good question. I wish I knew the answer to that. Especially in this climate where research funding for independent research is drying up and the chemical industry has unlimited resources to fund study after study after study, which are oftentimes poorly conducted studies. And sometimes in the case of atrazine, it's even in their best interest to submit poor studies because then the EPA says, oh, all these studies are done really poorly, and so we can't evaluate the compound. Remember, I was funded. I worked with these guys at Syngenta, so I know that was one of their tactics, is to present study after study after study that's inadequate, and they know that it's inadequate, but it just muddies the water. And then what the people hear is public is that, oh, all these studies were flawed, and so we can't tell anything. In fact, that's part of their plan.
What other, backhanded techniques do they have that we should be paying attention to?
Well, in my own case, for example, they specifically set out to discredit me. They specifically hired scientists to, quote, show that they could not repeat my studies, and then they went after me personally. They went after me when they couldn't prove my science wrong after spending, probably hundreds of thousands, probably millions of dollars. Then they went after me with personal attacks.
Was that effective?
No, that was not where I come from, you don't back down from a fight. If anything, it made their situation more difficult. If anything, it taught me, as I've said before, I now know I've been tested by the best. I have no fear of the rest. Because they spent millions of dollars trying to discredit me, you'll see in some of their handwritten notes, trying to link me to a scandal so that, the environmental groups wouldn't want to be associated with me, and they failed. I mean, they went through my life, they went through my science, they went through my data, and they failed. So I'm very confident now in both the science and the work, and then the way that I live my life and the choices that I've made.
Is there what they call disinformation out there?
Oh, absolutely. One of the tactics is you put information out there and you flood people with information. You tell people that, they'll say things like, I refuse to share my data. So, they're trying to discredit me. In fact, that's just not true. My data or science was originally conducted under the auspices and under the guidance and directly watched by Syngenta. They received all of my raw data, all of my information. In my subsequent studies, the EPA was in my laboratory, observing everything we did, collecting the data, reanalyzing the data. So the original data were available, but when people hear that, and they think it's from a reputable source, when people hear that my work couldn't be replicated, which is absolutely not true. There are dozens of laboratories around the world that I've collaborated with now and published with now that produce similar data independent of my work. The only scientists who found that atrazine doesn't cause problems in animals are the scientists that they funded.
There seem to be a collection of independent people who say that they're independent scientists that seem to justify everything that's GMO and criticize everything that's anti-GMO. Do you think some of these people are professionals?
Are they professionals? It depends on your definition of professional. They're professional somethings.
Are they being paid for their opinion to express their? Tell me that back.
So it's a known fact that, for example, in the case of atrazine, Syngenta paid scientists, they paid people to write papers, they paid pundits to put their names on ideas and opinions, and they paid people to go after me. That's a fact. So we have those documents showing that they paid people like Steve Malloy, they paid people like Alex Avery, they paid scientists like Klaus Werner and James Carr to say that they couldn't replicate my work. Those are words that were put into people's mouths and purchased.
And so here on Maui, we have this local initiative, and the local initiative is receiving criticism. Do you think that perhaps some of that criticism is manufactured and people are paid to criticize the movement?
Oh, absolutely. The industry will pay people. They'll have people come to talks, for example. They'll probably have somebody here tonight. They'll pay people to publish op-ed pieces in local newspapers and This is one of their tactics to try to really dishearten people and get people to back down, and to provide misinformation from those people who aren't adequately informed.
We have, an opportunity to put an initiative on the ballot. The companies are at the same time lobbying to take away our right to do that. They want to legislate and preempt the community from being able to make rules about what happens here in the community. Have you seen that happen elsewhere and in other ways?
That doesn't surprise me. I mean, I've been, for example, where I've testified in Minnesota, where the company will pay busloads of people to come in and sit in on the legislative hearings to influence the local Congress people, to make them think that most people don't want a safer environment, for example, to make them think that people really want to use chemicals that they know are harming the environment and harming themselves and their families.
So do you think people in this community would do well to be skeptical of people that are promoting the GMOs and criticizing the alternatives?
I would say always be skeptical. I'm a scientist. I'm skeptical of myself. I look at my data, I go, that can't be true, let's repeat it. My students tell me something and I go, show me the data, show it to me again. Don't believe me either. Go back, dig out the data and decide for yourself. Don't believe in anything, but follow the data.
Well, most people aren't scientists, and they're not going to have the ability to do that. They have to take somebody's word for it. The general public just, at some point just takes people's word for it.
Well, I think in that regard, and that's not to say that, I think you have to look at the source. And I think if you know somebody has a financial interest, a conflict of interest, then I think you have to question them more critically.
Some of what happens here on Maui and in Maui County is, experimentation. We're a petri dish because we've got 4 growing seasons, and they're doing unique work in growing seed corn, for instance, that they distribute around the world. Do you think that Hawaii and Maui County has some unique set of circumstances that makes it at greater risk than the rest of the country?
I think Hawaii is at greater risk for a number of reasons. One is these are new pesticides, new GMOs. These are things that have not been tested, that are being released into the environment for the first time. It's being released in a place that you can do it, I understand, 4 times per year, so you're getting hit harder that way. It's being released in an environment that's very fragile, that's very unique, a lot of endemic species, endemic ecosystems, limited fresh water, limited topsoil, and I think is an absolute disaster. What I'm hearing about what's going on here in Hawaii and on all of the Hawaiian Islands.
Do you think that they chose to do this work here in part because if something bad happens, they've got a chance in hell of containing it?
I think it's a possibility that they're thinking there's a chance of containing it. And I think also there seemed to be a way to go around the Clean Water Act, I was told. And I think, again, it's also a unique environment with many growing seasons where they can continue to do their research year-round.
And is there, in light of that, are there particular precautionary measures that should be taken here? That it's reasonable to take? And what I'd like to try and get at is the precautionary principle. At what point does the precautionary principle trigger in here in Hawaii?
I think the precautionary principle should be applied everywhere. I apply to my house. If I'm going to bring something home to my wife and my daughter and my son, and there's a possibility there's a risk to them, to their health, to their well-being, then I think we should have the right to say, no, we don't want that here. So not just in Hawaii. Again, I think Hawaii might be unique because of the fragile ecosystems and because the potential for long-term permanent damage. But I think the precaution principle should be applied everywhere. Everywhere there's people, everywhere there's animals, everywhere there's an environment that we care about, globally.
Is there a difference in the risks related to the growing of GMO entities and the pesticides that are associated with such practices?
Well, I'll tell you my issue with GMOs. My issue with GMOs are not with GMO directly. My issue with GMO is the following. 90% of the seed that we grow are owned by 6 chemical companies. They're owned by 6 chemical companies that are generating GMO products. There's an inherent conflict of interest. So the original promise of GMO was that we were going to have BT corn and we were going to stop using pesticides because the corn was going to make its own pesticide, for example. And it's just the opposite now. Now we're engineering corn and cotton and soy so that it requires pesticides, so it requires more pesticide, because that's what's in the best interest of the chemical companies that own the seeds. That's my biggest problem with GMO right now.
Is the United States isolating itself from the rest of the global economy because of this course?
The U.S. has a big impact, and the U.S. has the potential to do damage far beyond its own borders. So, for example, you'll often hear, I just did interviews in Canada, and you'll hear the Canadian government will say, well, the U.S. EPA approved it, or you'll hear the Australian government say, well, the U.S. EPA approved it. So the U.S. has the potential to do damage around the world because of the policy and because of the poor decisions that it's making, not just with atrazine, but with other agricultural practices as well.
The agrochemical companies, maintain staunchly that they are for farmers and that anybody that is against GMO is against farmers. What do you think?
I think so. Anybody who's against GMO or against farmers, and farmers are for GMO. I think the many cases I've seen of farmers who, for example, have been sued because GMO seed was found on their property or because GMO pollen blew onto their property, I think those farmers would disagree. I think the company has the money to find the farmers who would say that, but I don't know in general if you can make that statement.
Chemical cocktails. And so one of the things that we seem to be experiencing here in Maui County, there's some voluntary disclosure practices that have been adopted. And they simply tell us how much they put on and where they put it on, that we get a gross figure at the end of the year. But they don't tell us in what combinations. We don't know at what time they did it. What's the risk inherent in that?
Well, we've done some studies, and so have others, that when you get a mixture of pesticides together, you get effects, you get impacts that aren't predictable by looking at the individual compounds. We've shown that, others have shown that, and so it's a dangerous matter, and it's one that I think needs to be addressed. I think it's one that there needs to be reporting, and I think people have a right to know in their communities what chemicals have been applied and when they were applied and in what combination.
And the testing that they do, this is backing up a step, the testing that they do is isolated compounds. Could you speak to the difference of what they test for and what actually happens in the field?
I mean, there's some academic scientists that are testing chemical mixtures, pesticide mixtures, as well as fertilizers mixed in. But there's no systematic approach by the EPA or by anybody that I know of to look at mixtures, and on top of that to evaluate and assess mixture effects in the wild, or to even, it's almost an impossible task, one would argue, is how do you regulate a group of chemicals, especially when you might have farmers side by side that are applying different sets of chemicals. So it'd be like telling one farmer it's okay to use atrazine and metolachlor, and then saying, but it's not okay to use metolachlor and chlorpyrifos, but then the two farmers side by side are using them and they all get mixed in together. So how do you regulate that? It's very difficult. It's very difficult to study. It's also very difficult to regulate.
Well, they did it with secondhand smoke and cigarettes. Sure. I mean, there's 500 compounds.
Yeah, but we're talking 80,000 chemicals. That's a huge, and then even once if it were possible to look at every combination for even chemicals that's used on, let's say, 1 square mile, then how do you pick out which chemicals were the bad combinations? Was it the full mixture? Was it 2 chemicals in particular? Was it one mixed with this but not the other? It's very difficult. So I'm not arguing it's an easy thing to do. I think it's difficult to study. It's also difficult to evaluate, and it's difficult to regulate.
Well, so that's if we push for that, are we being unreasonable?
I don't think so. I think we have a right for environmental health, for public health, for our future. I think we have a right to push to know these things. For that matter, it's the food that you get. We have a right to know what's been applied to it.
In your experience, what gets sprayed in fields, does that leach into communities around the fields?
Oh, absolutely. So there's direct drift when you spray, right? So there's direct drift. But in the case of atrazine, for example, it can go up on dust and travel 1,000 miles and come down in rainwater. That's been shown. It's been shown in Europe. It's been shown here. So even if you were, for example, working on an organic farm, if you're surrounded by farmers in that community that aren't organic or that are using pesticides, then you're still at risk.
How do we get out of this mess?
It's difficult. I mean, I don't know that saying a complete ban on pesticides, or for example, is the way to go. But I think certainly with pesticides like atrazine and a few others, where we know that they cause harm to the environment, that there's a risk to public health, we start there and then we keep going. And again, I think atrazine's a poster child for what needs to be done, and we keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and we set a precedent.
And locally, I mean, local initiatives, is it worth pursuing?
That's the start. Grassroots and local. Keep moving forward and building momentum until we get bigger movements. I think that's the only way it's going to happen. I have no confidence in the EPA and no faith that the EPA is going to do it. And we have to take every avenue. That has to be litigation. It has to be pushing our representatives for legislation. And that also means pushing the EPA towards regulation. We have to hit them at all angles.
There are those who say that this is just ultimately going to end with the federal government stepping in and saying that Hawaii is a national security requirement, that the agrochemical companies, for national security purposes, need to be able to do what they're doing, and that we will become a recognized sacrifice zone.
That'd be unfortunate.
You think that something
but
like
it wouldn't
that
surprise me.
Right? You think that there is a scenario where that could happen?
Nothing surprises me. I mean, I've seen a statement from a spokesperson to the EPA that, in fact, I'll show the quote in my talk, that there's a price, that we put a price on shortened lives, et cetera, and we weigh that against the cost of removing the chemicals. So there's a price tag on all of our heads. And one of my big issues is we don't all have the same price tag. So oftentimes low income or minority people or maybe Hawaiians, certain states have a lower price tag on their head, and I think that's unfortunate, and I also think that goes against what this very country was founded on. I think it's unpatriotic.
I think that's an excellent place to leave it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your work.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
And quite the show, huh? We're both just like in our brains because there's just so much information that we're digesting. But
I would love for you to go online and look at Dr. Hayes's entire presentation. It's all up there.
Magnificent.
It's just extraordinary. One of the things that stands out to me most is the understanding that he's bringing forward, that some of the toxicological changes, some of the triggers that are happening because of exposure to these pesticides are not just happening now, today. They are fundamental changes in a person's body that don't necessarily get expressed in this generation.
in the grandchildren.
It could be your children that see the result of your exposure to these toxic pesticides. It could be your grandchildren and great-grandchildren that will see the results of the exposure that you're experiencing here today, and nobody asked your permission.
So check out Tyrone Hayes in Maui. I think GMO-free Maui is where you can find links to that. And then go to Shaka Movement at YouTube or shakamovement.org to watch further interviews and documentaries and information specifically from Jeffery Smith, but then a whole host of materials. So,
Jeffery Smith, we have him in the studio coming up. Joe and Jeffrey really go through, I think, a fantastic survey of what all of this is about, and we're going to cue that up for you now.
Aloha and welcome back to the Shaka Movement's Malama Aina show. So grateful to be able to have this opportunity to share these very important issues and messages and truths that are happening to us here in Maui County. And as we stated, I have with me right now Jeffery Smith from the Institute for Responsible Technology. He is the author of 2 best-selling GMO books, one called Seeds of Deception, which started it all off and inspired an entire planet of people to really begin considering the issues with GMOs. And then that furthered on to a book called Genetic Roulette, which has fast become another bestseller in this entire issue that we are discovering and exploring here. And then Genetic Roulette has turned into a DVD, a documentary. And so Jeffery is probably, if not the most well-known face and voice for GMO truth that exists on the planet today that I'm aware of. And it is with great honor that we welcome him here to Maui and to the Malama Aina show.
Thank you.
Welcome, Jeffery.
Thank you so much.
We're so grateful that you could come and join us here. Wow, where to begin?
Well, first of all, let's be clear about what GMOs are,
Okay.
And how they got onto our plate and into the fields. Because most people are unclear about one or the other.
Yeah.
So genetically modified organisms are not selective breeding. They're not sexual reproduction that happens between, plants.
Taking one plant and another plant and
right.
kind of shaking the pollen together or
Right.
something. Right.
So with genetic engineering, you could take a gene from one species, bacteria, viruses, humans, whatever, and force it into the DNA of other species.
That would never happen naturally.
Not in that way, no. In fact, the process of genetic engineering, which you can use a gene gun and shoot the gun, millions of cells into millions of genes into a plate of millions of cells, then you clone that cell into a plant. That process creates massive damage to the DNA of the plant. So oftentimes when it happens, you end up with plants that look completely different
Yeah.
because you've messed up the way that their DNA functions. Sometimes the plants look exactly the way they're supposed to, but they now have a toxin or an allergen or a carcinogen. And so the process itself creates what we call massive collateral damage. In other words, you're trying to do one thing, you end up messing up a lot of other things. Now, when I learned about GMOs in 1996, it was by a genetic engineer who was doing a lecture who said, this stuff is not ready to be put into food. There's so many things that can go wrong, and they're not testing for these. They're about to put them on the market, they're about to plant them, and then put them on the market that could negatively affect everyone who eats. And then once planted, they could cross-pollinate and spread in the environment, contaminating the gene pool forever. Because it's a self-propagating pollution that pollen transfers, and now it's part of the species. And the reason why it's on our plates and in the ground is really interesting. And this sort of sets the tone for the whole GMO discussion. The first Bush administration, George Bush the first, told the FDA, promote GMOs. And so they, in order to promote GMOs, they created a new position for Michael Taylor, Monsanto's attorney. And Michael Taylor was put in charge of policy at the FDA at the time that the GMO policy was being created. And the policy that he oversaw claimed in the sentence in the policy, we don't see any difference between GMOs and non-GMOs that's significant. And on the basis of that sentence, no testing was necessary.
That's the substantially equivalent statement. Yeah.
Essentially. No testing was necessary, no labeling was necessary. So companies like Monsanto, his former client, who told us that Agent Orange and PCBs were safe and DDT was safe and got it all wrong, they're completely in charge of determining if their foods made from genetic engineering are safe. And then Michael Taylor went back and worked for Monsanto as its VP and chief lobbyist, and now he's put in the FDA again as the U.S. food safety czar by Obama. So when a friend of mine filed a lawsuit against the FDA in 1998, it forced the FDA to reveal their internal documents. And 44,000 pages revealed that the sentence upon which the entire policy of the FDA and the government is based, that there's no difference, was a lie. The consensus among the scientists working at the agency was exactly the opposite.
Yeah, we understand that 26 of the greatest experts in the field were hired by the EPA to determine safety. And after 3 years, they quit and gave up because they couldn't even get access to the raw materials to test. They couldn't get any data from the industry itself. And they simply wrote a letter saying it is impossible for us to investigate and make a determination for the EPA because we have no access to any of the data or any of the materials in the first place.
Right. So this was a little later. So originally, the FDA scientists were saying, they were complaining about the policy. They were saying there could be allergens, there could be toxins, there could be new diseases, there could be nutritional
We don't
problems.
know.
They also said there's no way that the food companies themselves would be able to screen for these things. So there needed to be a lot of testing, including human testing, according to the scientists.
Yeah.
But the political appointee said no way.
Yeah.
And so when the FDA handed, first of all, Michael Taylor and his group were getting the policies written by the scientists. They'd send them back, and all the science was removed. All the concerns were removed. One scientist wrote in a formerly private memo, "What's become of this document? It's basically a political document." He said, "It's a what do I have to do to avoid trouble type document." He said, "There's no science in it. There's no addressing of the side effects."
Yeah.
When that policy was sent to the White House, the commissioner of the FDA said, "This is in line with the desire of the White House to promote the fast, safe, efficient approval of GMOs." Then when the Office of Management and Budget and the White House Counsel and the Department of Health and Human Services looked at it and said, "Oh, no. We have to make it look like GMOs are even safer. We have to show that they're substantially equivalent. We have to show that they're more precise and safer than regular foods. And we have to just eliminate these 12 pages showing that there's a problem for the environment because it'll give the wrong impression." So as the same document went up the ladder of the politics, GMOs got safer and safer. And now the U.S. government policy is to promote GMOs, and WikiLeaks, which is the documents that were made public, shows that the State Department is deployed on behalf of the biotech industry, bullying the rest of the world. We've seen that the USDA, EPA, and FDA are all mandated to promote GMOs. They've been blasted by people who are doing independent analysis. And yet the entire machinery of the government is saying, we don't have to do any safety studies. We don't have to do any labeling. We'll just let companies like Monsanto determine safety.
So where does that leave us here in Maui?
Unfortunately, it leaves you right in the middle of a very boiling pot. So first of all, to understand why Maui is in a very, very dangerous situation is that you have not only the GMOs planted here that are planted everywhere else, you also have experimental GMOs.
Yeah.
So this is the hotbed of new types of GMOs. Okay?
So these are things that never existed on Earth before.
And may never be approved because when they test them, it turns out, they had a negative effect on something.
Right.
And so the guinea pig is those who live around, especially around the zones, or anyone that's within the air range, which could be considerable with the winds. Yeah. So one of the aspects about GMOs, why would they genetically engineer? They say, it's to feed the world, it's to improve nutrition. It's to sell more herbicide. That's the primary reason. 85% of all the GMOs are designed to be herbicide tolerant.
Yeah, you have to use them in order to grow.
So you grow Roundup Ready soybeans, you spray it with Roundup. You grow Liberty Link corn, you spray it with Liberty. The same company sells both. Normally, Liberty or Roundup would kill the crops. The crops are essentially genetically engineered to make weeding easier. Yeah. So you can spray right over the top of the fields. Now, the Roundup, for example, gets absorbed into the crop, which we eat. They're testing crops that are sprayed with a component of Agent Orange, that defoliant that was used in Vietnam that was linked to cancer and birth defects. Yeah. That's probably being sprayed in Maui. And you're not being told about it. That's an example. So you have both the pollen, which I can talk about, the dust, and the agricultural chemicals that are associated with it.
Yeah, and then the combination of those chemicals.
Don't get me started about the cocktails. When you put chemicals together, they can be 100 or 1,000 times more potent than alone. Mm-hmm. For some stupid reason, the EPA ignores that entire body of science. And they go a step further. Roundup's active ingredient is called glyphosate.
Yes.
Okay, glyphosate was recently the subject of a review study that linked it to heart disease, birth defects, obesity, diabetes, cancer, digestive disorders, reproductive disorders, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autism, aggression, depression, anorexia, and now in a recent study, gluten sensitivity and kidney failure.
Yeah, all different types of digestive disorders
Right.
as well.
It's
yeah.
linked intensely to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a type of cancer. And glyphosate, that's what glyphosate, the active ingredient, the single ingredient surrounded by lots and lots of other chemical compounds that are used in Roundup. But Roundup itself can be 1,000 times more toxic than just the glyphosate.
Right.
So the EPA only involves an evaluation of glyphosate conducted by the company that produces it. So it's worthless. They ignore the effects of Roundup, and then they ignore the Roundup mixed with atrazine, the Roundup mixed with dicamba, the Roundup, all the possible combinations.
Yeah.
But even looking at Roundup alone, we see that it's linked. Its introduction and its expanded use is linked in correlational studies with all sorts of diseases, diabetes, obesity, autism.
Yeah.
These are things where you can see the rise of incidence of these diseases in the United States with the increased use of Roundup or the increased use of GMOs or both. So Maui is an interesting situation. Like everywhere else in the United States, GMOs are in the food supply in Maui. So the 9 GMO food crops, soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, papaya, grown here, as well as zucchini and crookneck squash, those we believe should be avoided because they're genetically engineered, and I can tell how to do that soon. Mm-hmm. But you also are ground zero for the environmental impacts to the environment and to human health.
Yeah.
So Roundup is linked to birth defects. And in Argentina, there were places where the birth defects and cancer were 300 or 400 times, 300 or 400% more than other places. And in one location, the birth defects were 70 times that of the national average. And it's linked to birth defects. It's linked to birth defects from many, many studies. It's linked to birth defects in correlational studies. In fact, a scientist in Argentina was aware of the peasants who were being sprayed with Roundup, and their offspring, many of them, had specific types of birth defects, horrible birth defects. Yeah. And so he injected the Roundup into embryos of chickens and frogs. They had the same type of birth defects.
Exact same, yeah.
So the environmental exposure to the pesticides is also linked to high cancer rates, and it's linked to a number of other things. And we're seeing, for example, in Kauai, where they actually have some data, very, very high levels of birth defects and cancer in the people living near these fields.
Yes.
And you know that they're getting sprayed because they're smelling the spray at night. And so if you can smell it, it means you're getting it. You're getting it.
Now, glyphosate has been found in breast milk recently. Can you speak a little bit about that?
You see, glyphosate or Roundup is used so often in so many ways in millions of acres. It gets picked up by, it gets evaporated into the air. It gets part of
in their homes.
It's part of the air samples. It's part of water samples, rain samples.
So that's right. It's in the rain.
It's in the rain.
That's right.
In the Midwest, where it's sprayed a lot, it's probably in the rain here because it's used a lot. So we have this exposure, a lot of this exposure, and they found it in urine samples of people living in Europe, in cities. So they weren't even being sprayed with it. It was in their food.
Right.
They found it in urine samples in people in the United States. Now they found it in breast milk. And it's in breast milk in such higher concentrations that they believe it's actually accumulating in the body. So this is the theory that we needs to be verified. Just by the numbers, it looks that way.
Yeah.
And this is something, of course, Monsanto promised that would never happen.
Yeah. Well, in fact, they said it was completely inert and it would just pass right through the system.
They said it was as safe as table salt and that you could drink it.
Yeah.
But it's actually used as a suicide agent. So don't drink it.
Yeah. Okay, I'll pass.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, the other thing, too, is that even if we stopped today, if we never sprayed another drop of Roundup on any of the earth, anywhere, it's still going to be active for dozens of years, is it?
So here's the deal. Roundup can bind with minerals, and it becomes fairly inert, and then it can split apart when it's
desorbed, they call it.
Desorbed, right. Instead of absorbed, it becomes desorbed, and then it becomes active again. Now, there is a way that it breaks down. When it breaks down to something that's even more toxic, called AMPA. But as it breaks down, it's theoretically leaving on the way out of the soil. Now, the time it takes for something to break down to 50% of its weight is called the half-life. Right. Yeah. So the longest recorded half-life for the degradation or breakdown of glyphosate was 22 years. which means in 22 years,
It'll be half as strong.
half as strong. Now, sometimes it's only months. It depends on the soil.
Right.
Depends on there's certain
But it's not consistent, and we don't know.
Oh, no, totally don't know. And they found in many, many instances and case studies that if you plant crops after you've sprayed in Roundup, those crops will suffer. The potatoes, the onions, other things, they'll have smaller bulking, they'll have fewer vegetables. What happens is Roundup, it takes the minerals and makes them unavailable for the plants, so the plants become weak and sick. It promotes soil-borne pathogens that can kill the plant and also cause diseases in many different plants. So you spray a lot of Roundup here, and your vegetables that you're growing in your own plot may suffer.
Yeah.
And they may become nutrient deprived, mineral deprived.
Yeah.
Feed them to animals, they can become mineral deprived. And this is what we're seeing, an epidemic of minerally deficient animals in the U.S.
Yeah.
So we're eating weak and sick animals, weak and sick plants. We're getting our doses of Roundup from the air, from the water, and from the food. And now we end up, it binds with the nutrients inside us, making them unavailable. It's linked to endocrine disruption, it's also linked to cancer and birth defects.
Yeah.
It kills the beneficial gut bacteria. It prevents it from producing things like L-tryptophan, which produces serotonin and melatonin, which are important for health and mood and behavior and feeling full when you've eaten too much.
Yeah.
All of these things can theoretically be dismantled when you're eating Roundup. Now, because you're being sprayed with a cocktail, here's some of the bad news. There's 90 different types of chemicals?
90 different chemicals, folks, as heinous as glyphosate.
So the 90 chemicals, when you get them in their body, the major organ that detoxes those chemicals is the liver.
Yeah.
Now, the liver uses certain specific enzymes, they're called CYP enzymes, as part of that process. Glyphosate dismantles many of those enzymes so that every other toxin that's normally detoxed by the liver can become more toxic because it's not leaving the body like it should.
It's accumulating now in the body.
So glyphosate can make all these other toxins far more dangerous.
Wow. Well, folks.
Wait, we have some bad news coming.
Yeah, we got.
Don't run away. We still have some bad news.
Oh my goodness.
All right, let me give you the bad news.
Okay, what's the bad news?
I have to build into it. Let me layer this, because we are going to give good news. We're going to give good news.
We promise.
If you leave now, you're going to be very depressed. In the middle of this discussion, you're going to be very depressed.
And we need to truly understand what we're facing, folks.
Yeah. So the thing is, you have an incredible way out with the Shaka thing, and I'll explain that, why it's so important, why the world is looking what's happening here, why it's so incredibly appropriate according to your Constitution, according to just the logic that no one else is protecting you, so it's got to be the people.
Yeah.
But let's give the full story,
Sure.
because we haven't really touched it.
Yeah.
So you have the Roundup ready crops that are sprayed with Roundup. Then you have the corn that produces Bt toxin. Now you know that's grown here because Bt toxin corn seeds, 80% of the corn seeds that produce the Bt toxin are grown here.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
Now,
Bt corn, folks, that is an insecticide that every cell of the plant creates inside the plant. They don't have to even spray it on anymore. It's actually within every cell, not just like within a kernel. Every cell of the plant is producing its own pesticide. Is that correct?
yes, and it kills the insect by breaking open little holes in the stomach of the insect.
Yes.
Okay? Now, it's also known to cause immune system reactions like allergic reactions in humans and animals. So it was put on the market because the Environmental Protection Agency claimed it would only impact certain bugs, certain insects, and not humans or mammals. By making that determination, they ignored the advice of their own scientific advisory panel, which are some of the top scientists in the country. They said, according to the mouse studies and the human studies, there's clear allergic type reactions. And in one case, there was damage to the tissues in the intestines. The EPA ignored the peer-reviewed published studies and said, just put that insecticide right into the corn. Now we know that the Bt toxin that's in the corn pokes holes in human cells, just like in insects.
Yeah.
So we're eating a toxin in the corn that's maybe poking holes in the walls of our intestines.
That may explain the whole leaky gut syndrome.
The leaky gut. So leaky gut is, so normally by the time, if something's going into the bloodstream from the digestive tract, it's broken down really small, tiny.
Yeah.
But if you have holes there, then you can have undigested food proteins getting into the bloodstream. They're not supposed to be there. It can get an attack by the immune system. So the immune system will attack this undigested food protein, and then it's like it takes a mugshot, so it gets out its iPhone, takes a mugshot, and then circulates that by the body's own internet, by the social media thing.
Yeah.
And then all the other parts of the immune system say, attack anything that looks like that. So that creates food allergies and inflammation. But there's something called molecular mimicry. Mimicry because the molecule looks like something else. And so the immune system gets it wrong. Instead of just attacking that food particle, it attacks the thyroid, or it attacks the gut, or it attacks the pancreas. These are called autoimmune diseases.
Yeah.
And one of the most common physiological characteristics of those with autoimmune diseases, where the immune system starts to attack your own body, is something called leaky gut or permeable intestines. And if the Bt toxin is poking holes in human cells and creating little holes there, it may be creating the ground for these autoimmune diseases. And it might also be linked to all these gastrointestinal problems that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Now, they found Bt toxin in the blood of 93% of the pregnant women tested in Canada, okay? And they found it in 80% of the unborn fetuses. So somehow it was getting into the blood, possibly through the holes it was creating. They found in mice that when the Bt toxin was exposed to the blood cells, it was toxic to the blood cells. So we may have a lot of toxicity in our blood, which could explain a lot of the problems.
Yes.
If it gets into the unborn fetus, and it does, they have no blood-brain barrier, so it may get into the brain of the offspring of this generation while they're still in the womb,
Right.
which could explain some of the developmental disorders.
Yeah, well, there's over 300 chemicals they're finding in newborn babies.
Yeah.
I mean, before they even come out, the 300
And they're finding
man-made-
Roundup in there too.
I know.
So now, here's where I said it was going to get worse. Here's where it's going to get worse. Okay?
And then we're going to get better.
It'll get better.
Promise.
It'll get better. So they're wondering, how come 93% of the pregnant women have Bt toxin in their blood if we know that the toxin should be washing out quickly? If it washes out quickly, and there's 9 out of 10 women have it in their blood who are pregnant, they must be eating it a lot. But, you know, with corn, if you have high fructose corn syrup or the derivatives of corn, they don't have the Bt toxin. And it wasn't Mexico where they eat corn tortillas every day, it was Canada. So they couldn't figure out, well, why are they having so much high percentage of Bt toxin in the blood? They figured it was eating the milk and meat of animals, because milk and meat of animals were fed Bt corn as part of their diet. I think there's another plausible explanation that they didn't cover in the peer-reviewed published study.
This is
Yes. Okay. No. I want to deliver this one.
All right.
I've been practicing.
And you're on.
Okay. So in 2004, they did their only human feeding study ever conducted on the GMOs, on a GMO that's currently commercialized. It was done on the Roundup-ready soybean. These are the soybeans you can spray with Roundup. They insert a gene from bacteria, it produces a protein, and that protein allows that crop to survive even though it's sprayed with a weed killer. They found that part of that gene inserted into the soybean to make it Roundup ready transferred into bacteria living inside our intestines and actually was integrated into the DNA of the bacteria, so it became an extra gene in the bacteria, and that bacteria was not killable with Roundup. It's kind of a Roundup-ready gut bacteria, suggesting that after the gene transfers to gut bacteria, it continues to produce the proteins, even long after we stop eating GMOs.
Right.
Now, as soon as the pro-GMO UK government discovered this, and they were funding the study, they never followed up. They stopped all funding. They never tested the Bt corn. What happens if you eat a corn chip or corn on the cob from Bt corn, and the gene that produces the protein transfers into the DNA of your gut bacteria and continues to function? What it's essentially doing is turning your gut bacteria, this is possible, into a living pesticide factory.
Right inside your body.
producing the Bt toxin over and over again. And that might explain why 93% of the pregnant women tested had Bt toxin in their blood, because they were producing it in their intestines.
Right.
It was getting through the holes in the wall, getting into the blood. So people always ask me at around this point, how do you get rid of it?
Yeah.
So different doctors have different theories, and I'm not a doctor, but I will tell you the good news is this. I have interviewed hundreds of people who've stopped eating GMOs, and we have ways that help people do that, who have gotten better from all sorts of diseases and disorders. From losing weight, gastrointestinal problems, erectile dysfunction, brain fog, headaches, including migraines, asthma, allergies, all sorts of skin conditions, aggression, depression, autistic symptoms, impulsive behavior, increasing grade point average, and ability to speak. So all these things.
To list a few.
To list a few. And I also interviewed doctors who prescribe non-GMO diets, sometimes to thousands of patients, and they describe the same thing. And there's animals, like certain mice that were fed Roundup-ready soybeans, and they had damage to their testicles, including the young sperm cells, the pancreas, and the liver. And when they switched them to a non-GMO soy diet, it started to get better. So we have a significant good news, and that is people getting off of GMOs often have an accompanying improvement in sometimes long-term chronic illnesses. On the other side, we have like the mice or the rats that were fed genetically engineered soybeans. The moms were fed starting 2 weeks before they got pregnant, and more than half of their babies died within 3 weeks, compared to 10% in the control. The babies were smaller and couldn't reproduce. Hamsters fed GM soy for 3 generations. By the 3rd generation, most were sterile. They had, many of them had hair growing in their mouths as a birth defect. They were also dying at 5 times the rate compared to the controls. So it's a very serious issue with GMOs. It can affect the next generation, in our opinion, and with certain technical things called epigenetics, it might even affect future generations if one person eats it who's pregnant. So it's a really serious issue, but people are getting better from it when they stop eating it.
Now, when discussing some of these experiments where they're working with mice and rats and what have you, the acceptable research that has been the research upon which all legislation has been created. Basically, the research stops at somewhere between 3 and 4 months. And after 3 or 4 months, they say, oh, we don't see anything. Yet these other studies that you're indicating are ones that have gone on for 8 months, 12 months, 2 years, a continued study, and then generational studies.
Right.
And that's where we see the real results. So that what we see from the industry that says, oh, it's safe, look at this and look at this, isn't, I mean, is it true that, or is it even, I mean, is it a complete experimentation and research by any stretch of the imagination?
Well, we use the word tobacco science. Can you figure out what we're talking about? It's like, let's design a study so that there's no way we can find any problems. So this is the way that the biotech industry, we've caught them red-handed, Monsanto in particular, and it's in one of my books, in Genetic Roulette, 41 pages, catching them red-handed, rigging their research using tobacco science. They got bad science down to a science. Now, even though they do that, they still end up showing problems because there's no way to avoid some of these problems with GMOs. And they'll ignore those problems and they'll claim, oh, these rats are fine, look the other way. In fact, I talked to a former Monsanto scientist. He admitted to me that when they showed that the corn damaged the rats, instead of withdrawing the corn, they rewrote the study to hide the effects. Now, when a top toxicologist from France, Dr. Seralini, who was reviewing the applications from Monsanto for approval in Europe, saw so many changes in the raw data. They saw Monsanto saying, passed with flying colors, look the other way. He said, wait a minute. There's over 50 different measurements that are statistically significant and different in Roundup-ready corn when you feed these to the rats. So he secretly did a study because he knew that anytime people do studies, there's so much pressure by the biotech industry to get them to stop and whatnot. So he did one in secret, well-funded, 2 years. Now, the biotech industry's, the longest animal feeding studies is actually 3 months. It's not 3 or 4, it's 3 months, 90 days. They started feeding these rats Roundup-ready corn, and the first 90 days, they looked okay. Starting in the next month, they started to get tumors. And by the time the 2 years were over, which is about the life of a rat, up to 80% of the female rats had tumors of the mammary glands. Up to 50% of the male rats. The control groups had like 10 or 20 or 30%, much, much less. And it was interesting that the rats, they were either fed the Roundup Ready corn that had been sprayed with Roundup, as it's normally done, or the Roundup Ready corn that had never been sprayed with Roundup, or the Roundup without the corn, just using the drinking water. All three characters, all three groups had the same results. Multiple massive tumors, huge, early death, organ damage. So the Roundup and the Roundup Ready corn and the combination were all creating it. Now this was absolutely significant news, but the biotech industry, as they do anytime there's adverse findings, they orchestrate a disinformation campaign and put pressure on media so they don't cover it. They put pressure on the journal to be retracting. So there's all sorts of ways that they cover themselves because they're not allowed to admit a single adverse finding. Because if they do, their entire house of cards, their multi-billion-dollar industry has to fail because food's not supposed to be harmful. Yeah. And yet, even in their own studies, when it was reanalyzed by independent scientists, when they were able to sue, get the raw data, and do proper analysis, it showed that Monsanto's own rats showed signs of toxicity within 90 days. Give it 2 years, a lot of them die.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everyone breathe.
Yeah. Well, there's so much information, and as Dr. Lauren Payne brings up often, it is almost impossible to really understand, because one of the pushbacks that we get from the industry is that over 1 trillion meals have been eaten of GMO products, and we don't see any health effects. And the first question that you'd have to ask, is where's your control group? Where's the group that's not eating?
Or even who's looking? In other words, you plot autism, for example, okay, against increased use of glyphosate, Roundup, or GMOs. And it's unbelievably tight. On my film, Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives, we interview 3 parents of autistic boys, including a oncologist, a doctor. They all say, when we took our autistic child off of GMOs, they improved. Gastrointestinal problems, behavioral problems, okay? You have livestock producers. They take their pigs or cows off of GMOs. The death rate goes down. The birth rate goes up. The conception rate, the litter size, the use of antibiotics and other medicines go down up to 3/4. Yeah. It's pretty simple. It's pretty obvious. Yeah. So the other side will say, well, there's no evidence. Actually, there's a lot of evidence, but they hide it and they create, and they actually have a very sophisticated way of countering evidence. So here's an example. Years ago, someone was trying to write a book on showing how Roundup Ready crops were damaging and dangerous, and they got a letter from Monsanto's attorney. Their publisher got a letter, and they stopped it. 3 days before it was to come off the printer, the publisher stopped it. And so they had to get another publisher, which was a whole deal. But in the letter, it insisted that there was no change in the levels of phytoestrogens. And they never claimed that there were. So they went, oh, good, let's look. Let's look for changes in phytoestrogens. It was like somehow they were clued into it. So they tested for phytoestrogens, and they were down 12 to 16%, and they're supposed to be fighting cancer and fighting heart disease. So, they were going to publish the study showing Monsanto's soybeans are not substantially equivalent. They're actually less healthy. So the information was they couldn't speak about it because it's ready to be published. Monsanto knew about it. Monsanto rushed to publication another study. And their study claimed, oh, no, we checked, not true. There's so much statistical variability in phytoestrogen production, we couldn't even do a statistical analysis. It's all over the planet, so nothing could be considered right. Now, it turns out that the lab that had done the first study did Monsanto's study. So the authors of the first study contacted the lab and said, what gives? Yeah. You did a study for us and got this. You did a study for them and got something else. The guy said, look, Monsanto insisted and forced us to use a detection method for phytoestrogens, which no one uses anymore because it gives variable results. And so they engineered the study to get variable results in order to overturn the study that was done with a proper detection method.
With inaccurate methodology.
And it was so easy to catch them red-handed with that, but it wasn't in the study. It was only, you have to talk to the people afterwards, which is what I like to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's such an interesting dynamic. I mean, because I've seen charts. I believe that the Institute for Responsible Technology puts out a chart of all the various diseases and the introduction of GMOs, and it's just extraordinary that you watch from like 1996, where you start here on your chart, and then 1997, and they're increasing and increasing and increasing the amount of GMOs that are being grown, and right behind it, in almost an identical curve, maybe a couple years later, is a whole host of diseases, 12, 14, 20 new diseases.
Yeah.
And the increase in those diseases is the exact same as the proliferation of these crops that are being grown and the foods that are being consumed. And when you have a possibility, right? And you see one possibility, and you look at that, and then you get another possibility, and when you get multiple possibilities, you get a probability. And then when you actually have multiple probabilities, then you have some facts. And we are to the point now where there are so many facts and so many probabilities and so many associations that it literally is undeniable that.
All right, let me wrap it all up here.
Okay.
Exactly what you said, because it's true that those charts, they're called correlations.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that it causes, it just means that it happens to be. It just so happens. It's just a coincidence. Now,
and those were all statistics that were public domain, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's from
totally.
the EPA and the health department and stuff like that.
So here's the way you look at correlation. If there is a cause, then you'd probably see it in the correlation. But it doesn't mean that if you see it in a correlation, there's definitely a cause. But here's how we look at it, okay? The American Academy of Environmental Medicine in 2009 looked at the animal feeding studies and said, these animals are sick. Gastrointestinal problems, immune problems, reproductive disorders, accelerated aging, organ damage, problems with cholesterol and insulin. They said every doctor in America, everywhere, should prescribe non-GMO diets to their patients. And many have. Thousands, in fact. In fact, I speak at medical conferences and medical colleges, and I know personally from seeing in informal surveys of audiences, thousands and thousands of physicians are telling their patients to avoid GMOs. Mm-hmm. Now, when people get rid of GMOs, they're reporting improvements, according to them and to their physicians and nutritionists, improvements in the same categories of diseases that the animals were suffering. When livestock are getting rid of GMOs, the same categories get better. When pets, your cats and dogs, when they're taken off of GMO pet food and given non-GMO pet food, they're getting better from the intractable diarrhea, from the allergies, from the fatigue. And if you look at the two main toxins in GMOs, which we did today, Roundup and Bt toxin, they predispose the system to the same categories of diseases and disorders. Now you look at those charts, and it explains why the correlation is so significant. Mm-hmm. The same thing is being experienced in lab animals, humans, pets, livestock, and can be explained by what we know simply from analyzing the toxins used in GMOs.
Well, all of what we're speaking about here today and everything that you've been speaking about in this interview is a direct result of what is happening here on Maui. That the Bt corn, 80% of it, folks, the seed stock that is creating everything that Jeffrey's explaining here, is grown right here.
Now, one of the aspects of, we didn't mention this, years ago, a consultant to the UK wrote a letter to the FDA before GMOs were approved and warned them that breathing the pollen from GMOs might create gene transfer. Now, we talked about gene transfer in gut bacteria. So you eat a GMO, it might colonize your gut bacteria. If you breathe GMOs, the dust, the pollen, and it has the DNA, in theory, it might transfer to the bacteria living in your lungs, right? Mm-hmm. The dust from crops that are sprayed by Roundup Roundup promotes the growth of fungus from fungal pathogens. Those fungal pathogens, some of them produce toxins. They're called mycotoxins, and they're known to create serious disorders and diseases. So we may be, in Maui, breathing in extra fungus and toxins and mycotoxins and the pollen and the Roundup.
Yeah.
So it's in the air.
Right.
It's in the water because it gets to the water table, the groundwater and the surface water. And it could be in the soil. So there's nothing actually that's sacred. You got the air, water, and soil, and you got the humans.
Yeah. Now, if you were to ask Maui residents who are watching this, and the Maui County residents, what types of diseases should they be looking for? What types of questions would they ask? Have you seen more cancer? Have you seen more, asthma? Have you seen more? What kind of questions would they be looking for as possibility correlated to? And because I've seen it. I mean, I look around, I see a lot of people with all different types of sinus problems, respiratory problems, huge early onset diabetes. We see cancer just all over the place around here, and people dying at very young ages. What are some of the other things that would be common in that regard?
Well, first of all, some of this is above my pay grade because I focus on GMOs and the chemicals associated with GMOs.
Yes.
You talk about 90 chemicals. I'm clueless for most of those. I focus because most of the GM crops are Roundup-ready crops, sprayed with Roundup herbicide. I study the effects of Roundup.
Yeah.
And I think I just listed, birth defects, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, autism, allergies, infertility, digestive disorders, anorexia nervosa, multiple sclerosis, aggression, depression, gluten sensitivity, kidney failure, among others.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? In the last 15 years, those have all of a sudden just kind of become natural.
Yeah,
it's like, oh, he has, or
cancer is the new healthy.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is that I understand that there's such a higher percentage of birth defects and cancer, for example, in Kauai than the rest of the country. And it's hard to get much higher. I mean, they're predicting that 1 out of 3 women and 1 out of 2 men are going to get cancer in their lifetimes in the future. How do you get to be 10 times higher in cancer? What does that look like? What does 10 times higher in birth defects look like? So I think there's more bad news, but I got to give people a break at this point.
I was going to say, what's the good news, Jeffrey?
All right. I promise you there was some good news, okay? So I'm going to give you good news from a national perspective, and then let's drill down into the Shaka movement, okay? So in the bigger context, we are seeing the early signs of a tipping point of consumer rejection, okay? That means consumers are saying no to eating GMOs. You go to non-GMOshoppingguide.com or download the iPhone application Shop No GMO. We teach you how to avoid eating GMOs. There's about 17,000 products verified as non-GMO. We list the products that are GMO in terms of the soy, corn, cottonseed oil, canola oil, sugar from sugar beets, alfalfa used as hay, papaya from Hawaii or China, zucchini, and yellow squash. Those are the 9 genetically modified food crops. There's also some bovine growth hormone, a genetically engineered drug injected into some cows, and so that milk has such high levels of a cancer-promoting hormone that I'm told by a former Monsanto scientist, his colleagues that were doing the safety studies on the milk refused to drink milk thereafter unless it was organic. One bought his own cow. So, we teach people how to avoid it, and now there's so many people avoiding it. 39% of Americans in 2013 said that they were avoiding or reducing GMOs, up from 15% in 2007. Now, what does that mean? It means that we have enough people to eliminate GMOs from the marketplace already. When Europe kicked out GMOs, it was not the European Commission.
Yeah.
It was Nestle's and Unilever and McDonald's and Burger King, because the food companies realized that the people in Europe had been educated about GMOs because of a high-profile food safety scandal that erupted in the headlines. Everyone knew about GMOs in Europe, not in the United States, back in 1999. And so in one day, Unilever said no more GMOs, and then within a week, virtually everyone followed suit.
That was a financial decision.
It was basically
they were going to lose money.
Exactly. So that was what we call a tipping point, and that's what's kept GMOs out of the food in Europe, not the animal feed, but the food. Now, we saw a tipping point against bovine growth hormone. Mm-hmm. It was kicked out of Walmart, Starbucks, Yoplait, Dan, and most American dairies from consumer education. Now we saw last year in 2013 a tipping point against GMOs in the natural product sector. And it was all economically driven. Whole Foods president said if something becomes third-party verified by the non-GMO project as non-GMO, sales increase by 15 to 30%. Who's going to not want to be non-GMO project verified? Everyone has to be non-GMO project verified because their competitors who are going to be increasing market share.
Well, and the other ones are losing 15 to 30%.
Exactly.
You have to be there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So because of the economics, the market dynamics of the situation, there's now 17,000 products that are verified as non-GMO, 10,000 in the pipeline. People are just rushing to become non-GMO project verified because they're losing money if they're not. But that's so far in the natural products industry. Now we have some test cases in Walmart, in Safeway.
Right. The cereals,
We have the cereals. We have the original Cheerios. You can look on the side of the package, it says non-GMO. The original grape nuts, front of the package, non-GMO verified. Smart Balance will be non-GMO. Target Home Brands will be non-GMO. Ben & Jerry's will be non-GMO. Chipotle's will soon be non-GMO. So you have some mainstream products that are boldly declare non-GMO. What happens if they start increasing market share? What if they start getting 3%, 4%, 5% increase in sales? If you were running the competitor's marketing program, what would you do? Would you wait and wait and wait and say, wait for it, we haven't lost enough money? You see, it's not like trans fats or sugar that has any consumer benefit. There's no benefit from GMOs. You have the weed killers, that you can survive weed killers, or it produces a toxic insecticide. There's no consumer benefit. No one is waking up in the morning saying, I got to have my daily dose of Roundup and BT.
Yes,
no one is saying that. So as soon as they realize that the tipping point or the trend is now expanded into conventional foods, the game is over. Yeah. The same tipping point that happened in Europe will happen here. We think that's going to happen within a year or two. And then for animal feed, maybe 3 years max. Animal feed, about 5 years. So we see an end, and the way to do it is to avoid eating GMOs. However, in Maui, so that's the good news. Let's first of all take a moment here and realize we have an opportunity to kick GMOs out without having to ask the government to do anything. Right. And in fact, the Obama administration has been worse, in our opinions, than the Bush administration in its promotion of GMOs in the United States and around the world. So we are on the way to do that. Vermont just passed a labeling law that will, if not stopped by the FDA or the courts, on July 1st, 2016, anything sold in Vermont will be labeled GMO. If it has GMOs, other states are passing.
There's like 27 states that are involved in either having attempted to pass and now are revamping or are in the process of
Actually,
ramping
now
up
it's
to
more.
pass.
Now it's more. It's over 30.
30
and
states,
there's
yeah.
ballot initiatives happening in Colorado and Oregon this year.
Okay.
So we're seeing an unprecedented awareness and awakening and revolution against GMOs. The March Against Monsanto last year had over 2 million people. This year it's going to have people all over the world. So what I'm seeing is, and we're helping to engineer, the elimination of GMOs by individual choice. Now let's get to Maui. Because in reality, you don't have the luxury of being out of the game simply by avoiding GMOs. Because especially if you live near the fields.
That's Kihei or anywhere in Molokai.
You're in the zone. You know, I was in Maui. Maui 10 years ago, and a guy said to me, "Don't try and tell me that there's not going to be wind-blown pollination. I paraglide off of Haleakala. Yeah. I know how long, and I end up on the shore. I know how far the wind blows.
Right.
You know, Hawaii was pure lava rock. Now it's a lush tropical paradise, 2,000 miles from the mainland or more. Where did it get the seeds?
Yeah.
Over time, nature spreads her bounty. You go to the Big Island, you say, this is the lava flow from 18 such and such. This is from 19 such and such. And you can see more and more vegetation. Nature will move, okay? Contamination happens. So you put a plot in one location, and they're trying to tell Hawaiians that it's not going to spread? Yeah. I mean, they just have to look at the mountaintop. They just have to feel the wind. They know it's going to spread. Okay, so I was in Kauai, and I noticed on one end of Kauai, in someone's farm, there was a single rice plant. No one has planted rice around there. They figured it must have come from the other side of the island, from a experimental planting. Mm-hmm. So you don't have. So it's not just right around the zones. It's basically you're in you're in ground zero. It's just there's the hotter and then the colder.
Right.
And you're in a situation where among the worst regulated products in the world that are dangerous are agricultural chemicals. They're among the most, let's say, controlled by the agricultural industry. So they were able to get things on the market and things out there with very little testing, no combinatorial testing between.
Well, they're testing here to see what happens.
without a control and without a monitoring.
Right.
And we already see an increase in certain birth defects. We already see an increase in cancer and certain things. I've heard some stories, and I'm going to be getting some more while I'm here, and I know you've heard some stories.
Yeah.
It's already obvious. People in Molokai, people in parts of Kauai, where they're around the zone, in the hot zone,
Yeah.
they're already really sick.
Yeah.
So you don't have, and what it is, you can't really, you can't expect the federal government to bail you out. They're basically bought and paid for. Then you look at the state government. They're basically highly influenced by the agricultural industry.
Well, our governor actually said that I am the biotech governor. I mean, came out and
Wow. All right, let's not go there. Then you look at the county councils, and they banned GMOs on the Big Island. They demanded full disclosure in Kauai and are being sued. That leaves you in Maui. What do you do? If your county council is not going to do it, what do you do? So now, for those that may not have heard yet, I want to ask you to comment, what did you find out that you can do?
Well, we found out in our Constitution, which many of you have heard, but if this is your first time, that the environment, the Aina, here in Maui, has rights. Just has this like a human being, and it's in Article 11, sections 1 through 10, and it's called the Public Trust Doctrine. And inside the public trust doctrine, it discusses what are known as the public trust resources. All the resources that are owned and available to all the humans who live here. And it says in that document that those public trust resources that are all of ours to share here need to be protected from any type of harm for current and future generations. It's in our Constitution. We're not making this up. Go look at it, Article 11, sections 1 through 10. And so we need to question, I mean, for me, it's very simple. You have this new type of agriculture, it's not considered soil-based agriculture, where you have soil and dirt and humus and microbes and all these things, because that's not what happens. When they're growing these GE crops over here, they actually sterilize the soil. Okay, like a laboratory. You go to a laboratory, you grow something in a lab, everything's sterile, so there's nothing that's going to interfere with your experiment, and so that you can guarantee results. Well, they're sterilizing our soil. That means they're killing every bug, every microbe, everything that is our native fauna and everything. They just destroy and sterilize and kill. And then they dump on a whole bunch more chemicals, making this huge soup, and then they plant the plants in that. And this is considered an oil-based agriculture. It's like a petri dish. If you know about labs, they have the petri dish and they culture things in there. Well, our lab is outside, and so you have these unknown chemicals. They've never been used on Earth before. They're brand new chemicals that no one knows what's really going to happen when you put them out in the environment. And you're mixing them all together in this soup. And then they're growing these life forms that have never been on Earth before until man made them up in a laboratory. These are alien life forms to everything on Earth, because they would never naturally occur on Earth. So you've got this toxic soup, and you've got these alien life forms, and it would seem to me that you might want to make sure that when you're doing that next door to everybody, that it's safe. It just seems reasonable.
It's constitutionally required.
And now it's constitutionally required. So that's what Shaka movement has done, is that they've gotten together a series of lawyers, and they've gotten together citizens, and we put together a new GMO crop moratorium, where we ask that all the activities be suspended. In other words, just stop them until we can get real world data. Not what research is telling us, and not what research is saying that it's safer. What's happening right here? What's happening in Kihei? What's happening to our aquifers? What's happening to our reefs? What's happening to our air? What is happening to our citizens right here? We don't care what you say about the past. We don't care about any of the research that has ever said it is perfectly safe. Prove it's safe here.
Now, I want you to know that this is, in my mind, the perfect use of this collective vote opportunity that has never been done on Hawaii before. You see, it's like what it does is it protects the Aina, the future, the children, the keiki, in a way that no one else is protecting them. We have as we started off this program, we talked about how the FDA allowed GMOs from an intense state of corruption and denial. And that's the basis of it. No one else is protecting. No one, they're all, the biotech industry has tremendous power and fingers everywhere, and they're not afraid to lie. We have caught them lying over and over again. My first book, Seeds of Deception, just catalogs lie after lie. If you look at the movie Genetic Roulette, it's like, who's going to trust these companies after you look at their background? Monsanto told us that PCBs and Agent Orange and DDT were safe and lied about it and got convicted in one case of $700 million from poisoning people near their factory. And they knew it was happening, and they had the data showing that they knew. So these are the companies that we can't trust, and yet they have tremendous power at the levels of government. That's the time you need a citizens' vote, where the citizens are not going to be fooled. Now, I have to say this. They're going to try and fool you. Yeah. They're going to create a disinformation campaign like you have never seen before. They're going to parade people in front of cameras and say, oh, you're going to hurt my job and my family and the agriculture and all this stuff. And we saw that in Prop 37 with the labeling initiative in California and also in Washington, where it was documented lies over and over again. It didn't matter because in a political fight, you don't have to tell the truth. There's no law that you have to tell the truth when you're fighting for a vote. And they exploit that all the way. Now, there's a question that I have, and that is, obviously, no one wants, I hope, wants their livelihood to be dedicated to producing poisons for future generations, for children, and for the population. So there's a few people that work for the biotech industry in Maui County. And if they knew the damage that was being created by the products that they're producing, I'm sure they would prefer to work somewhere else, but they would also prefer to have a job. Yeah. So one of the cards, I mean, first of all, what are you doing for the workers? Because if you create a moratorium and someone is just working for, and all they're doing is spraying or planting these biotech crops, they may be out of a job.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if their employer isn't doing anything wrong and there's no danger, they won't be out of a job.
All right. Let's just pretend that their employer's not quite doing their job. And so the employee has to lose their job.
Yeah.
So what do you see? How do you deal with that? Because I'm sure they're going to come up with that statement saying, if you vote for this, you're going to put all these people out of work and their families and whatnot. I mean, imagine arguing, if you stop asbestos, then all the asbestos workers will have to go home. Yeah. All the lead paint people, all of the people producing arsenic. It's like you don't want to be working in that area. I mean, it's the farm workers are going to get hit more than anyone else.
Yeah.
So I understand. There's a change that happens when people get healthier, when laws pass. But talk about the people in Maui County. What happens to the workers?
Yeah. Well, right now there are 4 or 5 different organizations that are working to help to retrain and offer new opportunities to those people. The Farmers Union is working right now on several different plans, and that they've actually obtained several grants in order to begin organic farming samples.
Wow.
Where they get 10-acre plots, and they cut those 10-acre plots into 10 acres into 5 2-acre farms, and that the amount of I think it's like 5 times as many workers work on 2 acres in organic situations with greater yields and greater profit than they do in conventional, and certainly not in commercial agriculture and GMO agriculture. So that this 10 acres can actually employ 50 more people than what 10 acres of GMO foods would
That's
work.
Brilliant. Now, I got to tell you, I've traveled to 40 countries or so speaking about GMOs, and I meet a lot of farm organizations. There's a farm organization in Brazil, and they created on-farm value-added where they produce something from their crops, and it's organic and it's sustainable. And they say, when they do surveys with the farmers and the farm workers, and they ask the results of the sustainable agriculture, they said, we're very surprised that it's not just better pay and more money, but they say, I'm happier. I get along with my wife better. I get more time with my children. It's like their happiness is so absolutely clearly better on this sustainable situation.
Yeah.
And the front cover of Newsweek talked about that there's a rash of farmer suicides in the United States,
Yeah.
and they blamed it on the chemicals changing the mood and creating depression. So I could totally see how switching to an organic-based agriculture, the workers and the farmers will be happier and make more money. And it's interesting, if you took the same amount of acreage that's currently devoted to GMOs and you converted it to organic sustainable, you would end up saving money because right now Hawaii imports 90% of its food.
Yeah.
So you could hire more people, turn the land into a flourishing land again instead of a sterile soil, eliminate the use of these toxic chemicals, and feed people with local food that wasn't
Yeah.
imported, saving the greenhouse gases from the transport, saving the money from transport.
Yeah.
And then I know I was with Mark Sheehan, a person here who's been here for 30, 40 years. He wants to create a World's Fair exhibition
Yeah.
of sustainable agriculture in Maui so that people will come in and see it and be driving, electric cars and bicycles and go through what is to be the ideal in Shangri-La, the ideal postcard, the real ideal. And that way, Maui and Hawaii could live up to the image that everyone holds in their heart
Yeah.
in here and around the world.
Yeah.
And it would make more money for people.
Absolutely. There are so many different ideas with different crops. One of them is actually growing a particular type of bamboo. And when you grow, there's actually, I believe, 3 types of bamboo. And all of these poison fields that we have to be transitioned, and they call that remediation. Okay, so you remediate, you clean up the soil. Well, one way to do it is to grow non-food crops, but still they are cash crops that help us in some way. And one of them, people talk about hemp, not marijuana, hemp, which is, the healing properties of many of the medicinals that come from it, the rope, the clothing, the paper, it just goes on and on and on. But bamboo in specific, which is very interesting, we grow this particular type of bamboo, and it harvests very quickly. In less than a year, you harvest this bamboo, and then you have a special type of burner, if you will, a power plant that's called a pyrolyzer. And the pyrolyzer burns at a very low temperature. It's almost like charcoal, if you will, and just burns it, and it leaves no residue. There's no exhaust per se because it's so hot and burning and in such a tight environment that it burns up all the gases that normally would go up into the environment. But then that leftover stuff, that leftover charcoal, is what they call biochar. And biochar is what you mix back into the fields, which then propagates all the different types of funguses and microbes and all the things and absorbs all the poisons out of there. So we simply could just, if these crops left that aren't helping us at all, we see none of the money from these GMO crops. They get all the profits, we get all the poisons. And if we were to have those fields, we could begin just growing bamboo and literally turn power plants on that would make our own electricity. And then from the waste from those goes right back into the soil to remediate the soil and create the healthy humus that we need.
Sign me up.
Yeah, and so we are aware of and have plans for well over 6, I believe it's 7 now, different types of opportunities that we have for the workers in these situations.
And I'm imagining that some of those jobs are actually entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
Because if you're starting new things, then you want, for those that tend to like to organize and tend to be self-starters, they may transition from a worker
Right.
to a business owner.
Yeah.
And maybe to a trainer, and maybe to a large-scale entrepreneur, because they worked here, now I can work there, now I can work there.
Yeah.
So I actually am very excited about this. I didn't know about this stuff. I think that it would be great for people to tour during this time when you're going to be doing the vote and talk about some of these economic opportunities.
Yeah. I have to say, though, to the workers, I am so sorry that, you got duped. You're working in a situation that is totally putting not only your life, but your children's life, your wife's life, your neighbor's life, everyone in danger. And you didn't know. I mean, we know that you didn't know, you know, and we know that this is a shock, and when this happens, it's got to be horrible. And the feelings that you might be going through hearing this information, I can't even imagine it. But I just feel so sad that, you know, that your life was put at risk in this way. And just know that I'm doing everything I can. And there's 15,000 of us here on the island who want to get you out of this situation so that you don't have to be in this poisonous environment. You don't have to be bringing those poisons home on your clothes and on your dirt and your children and your animals and your wife and everybody experiencing them. That's what's happening. And please, you know, begin thinking about what you're going to do. Alika Atai, or Ali'i, who's one of the 5 citizens, he says, okay, don't cause a ruckus at work. Begin teaching yourself about these things. He says, really learn them. Go to the website, shakamovement.org. But he says, so don't make a big deal at work, but when you get to that voting booth and you close that curtain, you know which box to check. Let us find a way for you to be able to have a prosperous life that isn't filled with these chemicals, that isn't filled with this short-term gain, where you might be making some good money now, but you won't be able to enjoy it because of the health risks and very possible cancers and different diseases that you will experience. They will happen in your lifetime. It's happening all around the world. It's happening to all the other farmers. And you, who are working in this capacity, in the field, spraying by hand and all these types of things, you are getting more exposure because you're using chemicals that no one else in the world is using. No one else. And so I'm sorry that somehow, because of you wanting just to take care of your family and pay your bills and buy food, that you got caught up in this mess. But we're doing everything we can to try and help you out of it. And you got to help us to help you out of it by supporting this moratorium. And if you have to do it privately and quietly at this point, we understand. But we're going to get you out of this mess. And we're here for the long term to do anything we can to support you and keep you fed, keep you housed, and give you opportunities so that you can live healthy lives outside of these outrageous and horrible conditions under which you have to work.
Joe, I am honored to be sitting next to you.
Thank you. It's really hard not holding back the tears, man. You know?
Yeah. It's beautiful. I mean, the love that I feel from the culture in Hawaii, I feel you are embodying and embracing, and I think everything that's been happening with the Shaka movement that I've seen is really honoring the culture, the heart, the keiki, the Aina, and the workers. I thought what you just said it's consistent with everything I know about you. And thank you for bringing that whole piece. People need to know that this is really for the benefit of everyone.
Yeah. Well, you know, you cannot separate this extremely, I mean, this is exquisitely unique culture that is Hawaii, that is the Hawaiian culture. You cannot separate it from the land. It is the land.
Yeah,
it
really.
is there's no separation between the people and the land. The land and the people are one. And their ancestors are the food. And this isn't just mythology. This was a way of life. There was an example of the most beautiful living in harmony. Thousands upon thousands upon hundreds of thousands of people lived off of this land before there was biotech, before there were chemicals, before there were pesticides and herbicides and all. They lived in harmony, perfect harmony with this land. And then people came and began doing these monocultures with the pineapple and then the sugar cane and now the GMOs. And they've almost destroyed it all. almost destroyed it all. And now we have the Kingdom of Hawaii, or the sovereign movement who's in Bumpy Kanahale, and all the different leaders who are coming and saying, yes, okay, we might have differences between us and the various different ohanas and tribes and what have you, but, and who owns what property and what, but unless we have property to fight over,
Yeah, good idea.
Unless do you want to fight over property that's dead and poisoned and killed? It's like, no. It is time for us to unite as one people, take care of this, and then we can work on the other differences.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
So it is uniting everyone, every culture. From the Filipino community, we have more Filipino community leaders stepping up, and workers and people, literally, that are coming forward. The Japanese community, the white community, every demographic is coming forth and joining together as one people.
And what better way to do it is around the children, the Aina, and the future.
Yeah. So we're going to have you on next week. I think we've really kind of done a number on everyone's brain here today.
We surely did a tour.
So everyone, we'll be right back with the close of the show. And, please check out Jeffrey's movie, Genetic Roulette. His books will be around town. Next Wednesday, May 28th, or this Wednesday, coming up May 28th at the McCoy Theater at 7 to 10. Jeffrey will be giving another presentation, this one with PowerPoint and slides, and really driving home the truth. If there is a voice of reason, a voice of truth. What I love about you, is that there's many people out there in the GMO world who are anti-GMO, and they're screaming and they're angry and they're da-da-da-da-da. And our brother here just simply brings forth the facts. Irrefutable facts about what's actually happening. And so if you really want to, and it's without the anger, and it's without the hatred, and it's without the finger pointing, it's just, here's the truth, make a decision. And so we're so grateful to have you here. We'll see you next week when you come back.
Very good.
And see if you can come and meet us at the MAC next Wednesday night. Aloha.
Aloha.
Welcome back again.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Shaka Movement's Malama Aina show. And we're just going to leave it at that because it's been a big show, and I hope you were able to see all of it. If not, please go to YouTube and or the Shaka Movement website to catch the entire broadcast of Jeffery Smith and Tyrone Hayes' exclusive interview with us. And so until next week.
Well, before we go, I just want to say, before this show actually airs, we're going to be getting feedback from the county of our petition count.
Yeah.
And we are expecting a certain percentage of those petitions to be rejected. People put in their P.O. box, or something wasn't quite right with their signature, and the county is going to kick back a certain amount. And the Shaka movement and the community here on Maui has been actively engaged in collecting another wave of signatures. And we've perhaps been more attentive. I think the petition handlers got a good education the first go-round, and this second round, I believe, will be a more accurate, a more favorable count. And once they will then have another period of time, just a short 10 days, to go through those signatures, and they will come back with a determination as to whether we successfully delivered enough signatures to put this in front of the county council, who will have an opportunity to ratify it, and then if they don't, then for it to be on the ballot in November. And this is so important. Please, especially if you've never done it before, please go register to vote. Mm-hmm. We need you. Maui needs you. You need you, your family. This is an opportunity to put away some of our differences and to rally around an issue that is so critically important, more than you know. more than you know.
So thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Aloha.
Mahalo. Aloha.